Let me just double check my watch. Muted. My laptop is muted. Okay. Oh man, I didn't mute my phone. That is frustrating. I did not mute my phone. I'm gonna start again. Hey, it's Rick Kettner here. Welcome back to the Startup Vlog. This is episode number 2. If you haven't checked out the first episode, I recommend that you go and watch that first. You get a rough sense of what to expect from this series. But here in this episode, I'm going to talk about the startup idea itself, the startup that I intend to build, and perhaps more helpfully, I'm going to be focused on the kinds of things that you want to think about when you're building a new startup, how to think of the idea itself, and where you should be focusing your time and your energy really early on in the startup journey. Now, before we dive into the details here, I think it's very important to note that when you're dealing with a startup, everything that you establish really early on is open to be adjusted and adapted over time. So nothing here is set in stone. Everything may change. In fact, I think it's fully expected that certain details here are going to change over the coming weeks and over the coming months. And it's also important to understand that when it comes to business, there is a spectrum from total startup business to established business model, something like a McDonald's franchise, for example, where you know exactly what your products are, you know what your margins are, you know that you need to hire specific people to join the team. You have a rough sense of exactly how the business will operate, and then it really just comes down to execution. So that's at one end of the spectrum where you have a proven business model and you simply need to execute and perhaps deal with a few variables like location and things like that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have a complete startup where none of the details are locked down. You don't know your product, you don't know your service, you may not even know your target audience. And for example, things like price point and margins and what kind of team you need, all of these things are up in the air. And so understanding this spectrum is very important because one of the most common mistakes that startup founders make is they treat their startup business as if it is an established model, where they set out to simply build the product and start their marketing campaigns and they start hiring people and they think that it all comes down to execution. They simply need to build it and then start to sell it, and they're going to be successful. But if they're truly dealing with a startup where there's a great deal of uncertainty, what often happens is they end up building their product only to find out that either customers don't want it or they aren't willing to pay the price that is necessary to make the entire sale and the entire venture profitable, or some other variables fall through and don't really work out as expected. So it's very important to understand the difference between executing a proven formula, as in the case with a franchise-based business, versus dealing with the uncertainty in a brand new startup. Because when you're in a brand new startup, your number one focus isn't on execution, it's on identifying the areas of uncertainty and ideally looking to address those issues as early and as inexpensively as possible. So rather than just making a wild gamble, you want to identify the things that could make or break the success of your venture, and you want to find opportunities to validate those things before spending a significant sum of money or time and energy putting together the business. Now, of course, your startup could be anywhere on the spectrum. You're not just going to be at one extreme or the other. Odds are you're somewhere in between, but you want to get a rough sense of whether you're more of a startup where there's a greater degree of uncertainty, or you're more of a proven business model. For example, you might be launching a brand new restaurant, and even though it's not McDonald's, you still know roughly what to expect. You know what kind of money people are willing to pay for food. And depending on just how different your restaurant is or isn't, you can get a rough sense for whether it's pretty formulaic and you can go with standard practices. Or if you're trying to do something very different, well then of course you might consider it a little bit more like a startup. So with all of that said, the key insight here is if you're dealing with a startup where you're trying to bring something to market that doesn't currently exist or for which there isn't a clear model that is already established, then your number one priority is dealing with uncertainty and being willing to be flexible and agile and to adapt to feedback and other information as it comes in. So with all of that said, we're going to focus on three important things in this episode: the startup idea, the product idea, and the customer. Now, let's kick things off by talking about the idea that I'm hoping to bring to market. Now, The startup idea itself is to address the issue associated with raising kids today in an uncertain world where it's very difficult to know what career possibilities are going to be open in 10 to 20 years and what paths or what opportunities are worth pursuing, what skills, what abilities, what things are important for kids to develop to be successful in a rapidly changing world where artificial intelligence, with automation, with technological advancement, all kinds of things like this are changing the career possibilities of people in dramatic ways. And for one of the first times in recent history, it's not very clear where the best opportunities are going to be in the future or how to best prepare for an uncertain future. So that is kind of the problem that I'm seeking to solve. Now, one thing worth noting here, when you're building your startup, a really valuable way to think about your startup idea is by defining the problem that you are aiming to address. So rather than talking about the product that you want to build or the idea or the direction you want to go, start by defining the problem as you see it that you're hoping to address in the world. And so for me and my startup idea, the problem that I see, as I just kind of explained, but saying it more succinctly, is raising kids to be successful in an uncertain world, in a world with greater uncertainty when it comes to job opportunities and things like that. And of course, it's no secret that the school system is really failing to prepare people for the jobs of today, let alone the jobs and opportunities of the future. So the problem, that's what we want to focus in on. The problem is that parents have more and more uncertainty when it comes to how to prepare their kids for this kind of future. And so likewise, with your startup idea, you want to start to think about what is the problem. And it's worth noting that this applies to virtually any startup, even if, let's say, you're creating something in an entertainment space. Well, even if what your product does is entertain someone, it's still addressing a problem. In this case, it might be boredom or loneliness or something along those lines. Maybe they're trying to get a date. Whatever the issue might be, you're solving a problem. It's very important to frame what it is that you intend to build as something that you're trying to solve in terms of a problem. So that is kind of how I think about the startup idea, especially really early on. You want to get clear on the idea. You want to get clear on the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, the second thing that we're going to focus in on is the product. And in some cases, you might come up with the product idea first and then work your way backwards to the startup and how you might be able to create additional products and services to solve or to more completely solve the problem in the future. But regardless of the way that you go through it, whether you come up with a startup idea or the product idea first, when it comes to the product, you want to get clear on a way that you can start to address the problem without necessarily causing your customers to have to dramatically change the way they think about the problem or to buy something they wouldn't traditionally buy. In essence, what you're trying to do is come up with an initial product that meets customers where they are today. So rather than completely reinventing the game or coming up with a solution way out of left field, you want to try to introduce your first product in a way that is likely to resonate with customers where they are right now without causing them to have to dramatically change their behavior or the way that they would normally interact with the kind of product or service that you are bringing to market. So in my case, just to give you an example again, I think the best place for me to start is by creating a book that provides the information and guidance needed to raise kids to be successful in an uncertain world. Now, one thing I really want to make absolutely clear here, just because I'm creating a book and you might be creating a tech product or an online service or something like that, this series is not going to be about how to write a traditional book. In fact, I'm going to be following much of the advice from Write Useful Books by Rob Fitzpatrick. And if you know Rob, he famously wrote The Mom Test, another very popular book in the startup space. And his approach when it comes to writing books is very much in alignment with this series, which is to focus on creating a book much like you would any other product or service. So focusing on things like creating a minimum viable product, attracting beta readers, even before those things, talking to early potential customers to gather feedback and ideas, iterating and improving the idea over time. It's very much a modern product approach to creating a book. So even if you have zero interest in either the problem that I'm aiming to solve or the idea of writing a book, I believe that this series will still be very helpful when it comes to the kinds of things that you want to think about when building your own startup. But again, when it comes to what I'm building, the very first product that I'm focused on is going to be creating a book to address this theme. Now, I do have a vague sense of some other products and services that I might get into in the future, and we may touch on those in future episodes. But right off the start, I'm thinking about the problem. I'm thinking about the first product that I can create, and without getting ahead of myself, I do want to mention I've already started in on some early customer conversations where I've chatted with people that might be potential customers in the future, and I'm doing so to identify the fact that they already buy books, they already read books, and this is an important point or an important part of what I just mentioned, which is meeting customers where they already are. So if you know your target audience already buys a certain kind of product or a certain kind of service, often it can be helpful to focus on that particular area first. And just a random thought that's coming to my mind right now is when you look at somebody like an Elon Musk, obviously operating on a completely different level, but when it came to introducing green technology to the world and his overarching mission of trying to reduce greenhouse gases and all kinds of pollutants, his focus is on products that people already buy, like automobiles. And then he's later going into things like home batteries and solar panels and things like that. So he initially kicked things off with products that people are already consuming and then is moving the bar over time towards things that people might want but don't yet consume. So that's kind of the idea here. When you're coming up with your first product, it's typically best to focus on things that people are already likely to engage with before, again, as I mentioned earlier, pushing them into other areas that might not be as common or things that they're comfortable buying at the current date. So that's the idea here. I'm going to be starting with a book. And again, as I mentioned, I'm going to be treating it just like any other product or service. So we're going to be doing the common things that we need to do to validate the idea throughout the process. And that takes us to the third component, which is the customer. Now, this is interesting because, as I alluded to earlier, these three things, they don't necessarily go in a set order. You can start with the startup idea, you can start with the product idea, you can start with the customer idea, and work backwards, whatever works for you. But typically, once you have a product or startup idea, it's very important to get clear on the ideal customer, not just any customer or the kind of person that might be interested in what you have to buy. You want to start to hone in on who you think is the best customer. And there are a number of books out there, including The Lean Startup and Blue Ocean Strategy, that talk about the value of understanding that your initial idea of who the customer might be could turn out to be entirely wrong. And so you might start out with the idea that selling your product to a certain audience is going to be perfect and it's going to work. And then later you might find out that the product idea flops, but it's not so much the product as it is the target. So for example, you might aim to create a teeth whitening solutions for dentists. And I think this example comes from perhaps Blue Ocean Strategy, but you come up with an idea to solve teeth whitening for dentists, and it turns out that for any number of reasons, there isn't really a go-to-market strategy there that is effective. Either dentists don't want to provide that product to their customers, or they can't do so profitably, or perhaps they just want to focus on their core competency. Whatever the reason is, you might decide that it's actually better to sell that to customers directly, to the consumer market directly in the form of whitening toothpaste. So you can take the exact same solution or the same premise, identify a different audience that is more likely to purchase it, and you can rethink your idea completely by identifying a better audience or an audience that at least is more likely to buy your product or service, and then you can reformulate the business. So it's really important to nail all three of these components. Now, for me, with my idea, I think the ideal customer is the parents raising kids. Now, it's safe to say there are other options out there. It's not like this is the only option. You could focus on school districts. You could focus on online video training platforms. There are all kinds of directions that you could go. In this case, my best guess at this early stage is going direct to consumer and selling a book that meets the needs of parents that are looking to address this problem with their kids, but that isn't necessarily a given, and that's the point I'm trying to make here. There might end up being an alternative strategy. In fact, even the idea of creating this solution in this particular category could be completely rethought, and I could instead try to focus on retraining adults from an existing career to a new career. There's a completely different way to think about the problem and a different audience that could, in theory, be addressed. But I've chosen clearly to address a younger audience, how to raise kids to be successful in an uncertain world. And because of that, then naturally, at least at this stage, it seems to make sense to create a book that is going to be read by their parents. And not only does that mean that I can validate the idea by talking with parents and finding out, do they read books? Yes, they read books. Do they buy books? Do they go to their library? I can learn more and more, and then I can determine whether or not I feel like have a promising enough idea that I'm worth moving the idea forward and gathering additional feedback. But those are the three things. Just to kind of zoom out here for a second, we talked about the solution and reframing that as the problem. We talked about the product itself and ideally trying to come up with a first product that is going to meet customers where they are today. And then, of course, honing in on who you believe is going to be the best initial audience, the customers that are going to value what you produce most relative to others. So even if you have a product that might have broad mainstream appeal, you want to identify an audience that is going to benefit most from what it is that you offer. And once you have these three aspects, you can begin to move forward and gather more information. Now, in the very next episode, we're going to talk about the common assumptions that startup founders make and how to address them early so we can get a better sense of whether the idea has a chance to succeed or not. And we're going to talk about the importance of early customer conversations, talking with people even before you build your product so that you can get a better sense of whether or not you're moving in the right direction, and you can gather important feedback that might steer the product in a slightly different direction moving forward. So it's both validation of the idea, and it's about actually improving the idea as you talk with customers and getting a better sense for things like positioning and how to speak the language of your customers when it comes to positioning and other elements like that. What kind of marketing is going to work and things like that. So in the very next episode, that is what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on how to conduct these early customer interviews, the kinds of questions that you want to ask people. I'm actually going to be explaining the questions I've used because I've already started this process where I'm talking with early potential customers. So I'll talk about the exact questions I'm using and the logic behind them, and some other insights from a book like The Mom Test by Rob Fitzpatrick when it comes to conducting these kinds of early conversations. And so stay tuned for that episode. As I mentioned in the previous episode, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to make sure that you don't miss out on future episodes. The rough plan at this point is to cover or to launch new episodes every Friday around 9 a.m. Pacific time, but that schedule might shift or might adapt based on the number of things to talk about or whatever else might happen in the future. But anyway, that's it for this episode. If you have any questions or comments about anything that we covered here or anything that you would like to see covered in future episodes, then leave a comment down below to let me know. Post a comment here on YouTube, and I look forward to connecting with you again in the next episode.